Hello
on.
and welcome to the Property Trio. We are on and live, and I'd like to welcome my two co-hosts, Mike Bortlock and Cate Bakos. How are you both?
See you, Dave. You got a spring in your step. You had a good time in Bali.
Yeah, it was very nice, although it seems like a
Nice.
while ago already. How was both your school holidays?
Yeah. I've got a year 12, so there's not a lot of holiday in school holidays right now. I feel like I'm doing year 12. She's just studying.
Right.
That's for
Mike,
next
you
year.
had a episode at the Taronga Zoo, was it?
Yeah, just like basically all my worldly possessions at that point in time, and including two children, were sort of lumped on me to trek around. It's amazing how the legs get tired, but it's a conditional tiredness. You know, if they're kind of walking around, they're very heavy. If they're walking to, say, an ice cream shop, there's a new lease on life.
Yeah, exactly. So today's episode is the auction campaign from an agent's viewpoint, which we thought we'd peel back the curtains, and this is Cate's episode, and give our listeners an insight into what an auction looks like from the agent's point of view. So we often talk about property acquisition experiences from the buyer's perspective, and Cate, you've spoken on the show over the years from your perspective as a buyer's agent, but today's episode is a little bit different. We often find that when we step into another person's shoes, we get an appreciation of the situation from their side. Today is all about demystifying some of the agent speak when it comes to auctions, but it's also about educating our listeners to be able to get a better appreciation of the twists and turns an auction can deliver. So, Cate, I'll start with asking you to quickly detail the key differences between auction campaigns and regular sale campaigns.
Yeah. A short tenure campaign is the hallmark of an auction campaign. So people will pick that for various reasons, but one of the benefits is the vendor knows that it starts and stops in the space of something between 20 and 30 days typically. So 4 weeks is not unusual. When we're in the heated spring market, it might be a 2 or a 3 week campaign. You have a different authority document that you sign as well. So rather than signing an exclusive sale authority, you'll sign an exclusive auction authority. Documentation changes from state and territory, but generally speaking, there's a different one for an auction. And you have obviously intensive period to market that property and make it look its best. And so you'll have higher furniture, you'll have glossy ads and printed material. There's a little bit of overlap with the private sale campaign, but typically you're going all in for that 3 week period, and you'll often find that a property will be vacated. So they might move the family out, or if it was rented, you move the renter out, and you've got an opportunity to show it in its best light in a short space of time. There's a bit of a mistake with pricing, I have to say. We've got quote ranges in certain states. We've got Queensland that don't quote at all. And the agents often are mysterious about pricing, and I know we'll delve into that a lot more in this episode. And that's probably the hardest part for purchasers. They're not really sure how to price the property or where it could land, how many people it will attract, and they don't feel that they hold that power to make an acceptable offer and just purchase the property. They've got to usually wait until auction day and take that chance that someone could want it as much as they do. So in a nutshell, that's the difference between an auction and a private sale.
You know, you talked about the price, Cate, and this is something that made sort of national media some time ago, and especially in Victoria, it sort of seemed to be the epicenter of underquoting. And I actually ran a little exercise for like a little satirical podcast I had back in the day where we looked at auction listing prices and compared them post-campaign across every state in Australia. And surprise, surprise, Victoria won, the underquoting capital of Australia. What's going on here, and why do agents do it, and is it an industry-wide thing?
Well, I just also would say, because Melbourne in particular has more auctions than any other city, that would be a part of the correlation why there's more underquoting in Melbourne and Victoria.
Well, we compared the same sample sizes. So in that particular instance, it was beyond statistical reproach, Dave. But you're right. I mean, Melbourne is a very
you did 100
popular
auctions versus 100 auctions, or
yep,
yeah, okay.
And you know what? It depends on when you take the temperature as well. So I know we've just got off track here, but that's all right. We're good at that. In a heated market, you'll find that auction underquoting feels like it's more significant and more severe. And the reason for that is you've got a higher chance that the agent is genuinely surprised with the result in a heated market. Right now, if we ran those stats, I don't think Melbourne would win on the underquoting stakes. I've experienced Adelaide auctions when I've gone out with Pete Kalizos. I've seen results in Sydney. Underquoting happens a lot everywhere, and it's a real challenge to deal with. But yes, you're right. Melbourne has had its fair share. I mean, I've seen some really hideous underquoting efforts, and particularly when the agent knows what the vendor's expectation is and knows the likely selling price. That is underquoting by definition. And sometimes they get a tough rap when the result spins way past where anyone expected it. People get a bit angry with the agent. It's not always their fault, but when they're deliberately quoting it lower than they know the vendor's prepared to sell at and where they realistically know it should land, that's when they've got blood on their hands.
So you're saying you think it would happen more often when in a hot market?
I think the stats that Mike's looking at would occur more in a hot market. What we don't get to see, and it's one of the annoying mistakes about auction, is we don't know during the advertising period, so during the campaign, what the vendor's reserve is, because it's not publicly listed. They don't even have to put it on the form in Victoria. They can sign the form and leave it blank and then tell the agent and the auctioneer on the morning of the auction what their reserve is. And so that's the challenge for everyone here. So measuring underquoting is very difficult for anyone. You know, if a compliance officer was to look at it, the only real indication that they've got is when they can see that reserve price stated on the authority. And that's the day of auction in most cases.
Wouldn't that be great data to have, just as historical record? Every auction campaign, we can see the reserve. I mean, as a data sort of nerd, the mind boggles at the fun we could have with that. And you know what? It kind of makes sense what you're saying. Well, it makes perfect sense. I should clarify that. But when you're in a hot market, there are always those auctions where the auctioneer and the agent just kind of look at someone like you as an advocate and go, whoa, like that was ridiculous. Like that just validated our reason for going to auction in the first place, because I don't think we would have got anywhere near that as a private treaty, right?
Oh, look, they'll sometimes say that. The reality is any educated buyer or a professional who's conducted due diligence and pricing analysis will know where a result should land, and they'll have formulated a price that they're prepared to stop at. And I often tell clients we shouldn't really go above that, because at that price point you can get something better. You're opening yourself up for the risk of overpayment and potentially a valuation shortfall risk. And we've talked about that a lot on the show. So, you know, there's a price that you've got to stop at. But sometimes you'll be dealing with a highly emotive buyer who absolutely has to get that site. They want it for emotional reasons. It might be next door to mum and dad, or they're looking at doing a development and they need to secure the last piece in the block. There are reasons why people will go really hard, but I digress. Mike, you asked me earlier, why do agents underquote? And it's a good question. There's an old saying, quote it low and watch it go. And the idea is that they like to attract as many buyers as possible and let social proof do the rest. So a buyer will come and see a property that they thought that they could afford. They'll fall in love with it because it's better than their budget. They'll see lots of other people crawling all over it and they'll find a way to stretch, and then they might get carried away at auction. That's the idea behind underquoting. It doesn't always work. In fact, sometimes it backfires. If it's too underquoted, I've seen situations where the agent has a pool of eligible buyers who don't have enough budget. So how eligible are they really? And then I've come in with the right price and secured it. So it doesn't always work, but you know, sometimes you see crazy results because they've managed to just pull in such a crowd. The other issue that we have is when an agent's underquoting, then the other agents in the area will feel compelled to do the same because they don't want their vendors to be at a disadvantage. So you don't want to have a $1 million property that you were planning on quoting, 9 to 990, and then a similar house in a nearby street is quoting 8 to 880. You know that they're likely to sell for the same price, but the agent who has the vendor who was prepared to quote at 9 to 990 is now thinking, I don't want to have their campaign cannibalize all of my buyers, and all of a sudden I've got a rubbish campaign. And so you're keeping up with the Joneses effectively. You're doing what you can to hold that buyer pool on your property. So, it's a bit of a race to the bottom.
That is a real hard situation because, the agents have to run their business and maintain competitiveness. So it kind of really demands that the regulator be on top of this sort of stuff. But that sort of seems like an uphill battle, like the sheer volume of stuff and not necessarily having a dedicated property kind of ombudsman. Like, is it over before it's begun?
It's really hard, Mike, because we've got Consumer Affairs in Victoria. We've got Office of Fair Trading in New South Wales. We've all got these organisations that are meant to be there looking out for the consumer and keeping the agents on the straight and narrow. But the combination of limited people power, limited funding, and limited understanding of how our industry works means that they're generally a bit of a toothless tiger. And I'll see the occasional, suits out there with a clipboard at an auction, and you can see the agents freaking out and re-strategizing. But generally, you don't see much of Consumer Affairs. You can make a complaint. What does it serve, though? I think the important thing here is understanding your values, not missing out on a property for a price that you should have been prepared to pay.
Yeah. And I think it's so subjective. I mean, look, underquoting, it's a major topic of discussion among consumers and the media. Cate, can you explain to our listeners why it's so challenging to eliminate and for Consumer Affairs, Victoria, or whichever state to get involved and stamp it out, some of the complexities involved?
Yeah, the short answer, the simple answer is that valuing a property is a combination of art and science. If it was perfect science, if it was a parcel of shares, no problem. We know what that share's selling for today. Properties are so unique. They're different. They're like people. There's no property that's identical. So for some comparable sales analysis reports that I put together, I can say to the client with high confidence, I predict that this will sell for this price tag because of these comparable sales, and there's many of them and they're recent. And that might be a block
and that's
of
so
apartments.
important, isn't it?
Yes. And then you'll spend 4 hours doing rigorous analysis, and you won't have enough comparable sales that are either recent or comparable to be telling a client with high accuracy that you know exactly what it will sell for. And so then you've got to do a summation method where you're looking at the value of the land. And again, that's subjective because the orientation, the size of the block, the terrain, there's so much art and science to this. It's very hard to be exacting. Even two valuers won't necessarily agree with each other. So if valuers can't agree with each other, how can the regulator find a price tag that they're comfortable with, and how can they hold the agent accountable for getting it wrong when a valuer would probably have a challenging time? So that's
ultimately,
it's hard. And the other one is
down
the sheer
to
volume.
Yeah. I mean, it's the recency and the similarity of comparables at the end of the day, isn't it?
It is.
And every property is different. And as you just touched on, like some units or apartments, it could be an apartment next door that's essentially the same size, shape, orientation, etc. That's pretty clear. But you can have a property that's very unique. Nothing else is sold, not in that street, but maybe even that pocket of the suburb, or even that suburb or that little country town for an extensive period of time, and those that have it, totally different properties.
And Dave, we've just talked about two of the challenges. There's another challenge. So the first challenge is that no one can get pricing completely accurate. I mean, the number of times I say, I think it'll go for X dollars, I might be out by 10 or 20 grand and I'm doing a little dance. And occasionally I'm bang on. I remember saying to a client, that property won't sell for anything less than 2.2. I reckon that's where it will land. And it absolutely did. It landed 2.201 and I looked like a hero. But we can't always predict it accurately. And then when we think about the sheer volume of sales, we're asking a regulator to keep an eye on it. I mean, in Victoria alone, we can have auction weekends of 1,500 auctions. And so how do they police all of those campaigns over that period? There's not enough people on the ground. And then the last one is the buyer. If you were to hold an auction one Saturday and then hypothetically re-auction that property a week later, the market hasn't changed in a week, but the buyers have. And so that auction result will most definitely be slightly different. And you can't anticipate whether a buyer will be irrational or very rational, or whether they'll be coy. And so that will influence the auction. It could be, the way that the agents manage the campaign. An auctioneer did a great job or a terrible job. The tenant has made accessing the property very difficult, so they've got a limited buyer pool, or the tenant's presented the property really badly. There's so many things that can influence price. We can't expect a regulator to be able to get perfection out of a campaign.
Yeah, and look, the other side of the coin, because we're always thinking about this, or often thinking about this from the buyer's perspective, is to actually think about it from the vendor's perspective. Which property owners want to have legislated that once they nominate the price they're happy to sell their property at, that they must sell it at that price should someone offer that price? When you potentially have two or more people who are willing to pay a lot more, and all of a sudden you only discover that on the auction day, but you're legislated, which you're not. So that's sort of like, if we actually flip the coin and think of it from the vendor's perspective, it becomes, I think, a bit easier to understand why this is so subjective, and in fact why it's not something that you legislate. Because if you're selling an item or an asset, you want to get the best possible price you can for that asset. And so you have the prerogative to change your mind as to what price you're willing to sell that asset for.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many factors to this, and so many reasons why prices can deviate. I mean, I keep an eye on all of the auction results in Melbourne over the weekend, and if I'm active in a particular pocket and I can see one result was crazier than I was expecting or disappointing, I can call the agent. So what happened with this one? And there's always a story, always. Oh, we lost our leading buyer on the Friday night because they bought something else, or, someone dropped out of the runnings, or the vendors fessed up to us that they absolutely need to sell, and they gave us a way lower, and more realistic reserve than we were expecting. Or, there's a twist all the time. There's always a story.
Yeah. So putting quoting regimes to one side, clearly the agents try to attract buyers who may not have the budget for the property, as you've just touched on before. How do agents work out their buyer's interest level, though? And after all, no vendor will be thrilled if the agent produces a group of interested buyers with insufficient budgets on auction day. So how do they manage that?
They are clever, and they've got the aid of a great CRM. So the agents will take your name and number at the door. It's not just to send you a contract of sale, it's to map what you're doing. And particularly when you're dealing with a franchise group and there's offices across your city or town, they will be able to see what activity you've engaged in with any of their campaigns in previous months or years. And so they'll punch in your name, but behind that front page on their iPad, they'll identify all of the properties that you've made offers or bid on, and likely where you've bid to. So they understand what your budget was last time you were on a property. So they've got a lot of information on you. They've also perfected the art of having good dialogue with you. And I don't ever encourage clients not to speak to agents. I think there's value in letting them know what you're looking for and where you're up to a point, because they'll be able to tip you into things that might not be advertised, or tell you about upcoming listings, or just give you a bit of preferential treatment or a bit more time when you need time. So it's not a bad thing being friendly with the agents, but they're very good, very skilled at getting information out of you to work out whether you're in the game or not. They can tell if you love the property, but they more importantly can tell if you've got the right dollars, because they'll have that dialogue with you. They might ask you, how you went on a particular property or why you didn't bid harder, and they'll get that out of you. So the agent needs to be able to confidently say to the vendor, these guys have asked for a contract, they brought their parents back, all of those hallmarks that indicate that you're keen on the property. And then they can also say, my buddy Will from the other office reckons that they made an offer on XYZ 2 months ago for X dollars. So we know that they've got the money. And that's not always an ironclad guarantee for an agent, because circumstances can change for a buyer. But they generally have a pretty good idea of who's who in the zoo.
Yeah, so in summation, what you're saying, if they're a good agent, they're going to have a pretty good understanding of where your budget lies. Yes. And so if you sort of play funny buggers with them and perhaps are not as open and not as friendly to them, it actually can count against you.
You've got to be very careful when you're playing undercover or playing funny buggers, because you need to make sure that you don't miss out on an opportunity. And sometimes I've seen buyers do it really well, and sometimes I have to play coy and do it well, because there are some agents you don't want them to know what you could go to, and your client's already played the emotional card. But you've got to make sure that if you're interested in that property, they will give you a notification if someone else makes an early offer on it, because you don't want to be the person that doesn't get the phone call or the text message. So it is important to say to them, I've got interest. You don't have to say, I love it, and bring your parents through. You can actually just say, can you please keep me informed if anything moves on this property prior to auction day?
Sounds a bit like being sort of like a disaffected teenager, like there'll be certain things that you think are cool, but it's not cool to be too enthusiastic. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's right. Channel your teenager vibes.
That's my 10-year-old at the moment on a lot of things.
Send him
do you want to go and do this? Yeah, whatever. I'm like, well, like a year ago, you would have squealed with delight.
Yeah, exactly. So if the agent is fearful that they don't have an adequate number of interested buyers, what will an agent do?
Yeah, they will talk to the vendor about what can we do to either rein in more buyers, or should we be thinking about selling it to one key buyer? And all of that will come down to who they have on the property. You only need 2 people to have a great auction. That's all. But if you've got one really strong person and one maybe, well, you might have a decision to make. But if the agent's fearful at the early part of the campaign that they haven't got enough coverage, they'll probably look at reducing the quote range to pull in a few more people. But what they'll also need to do is chat to the vendor about their price expectation. Because if the property is already priced in a way that should be attracting buyers, there might be something that the agent and the vendor haven't had the conversation about. There could be some elephant in the room that's a bigger issue than anyone imagined. Let's say the bedroom sizes, 2 of the bedrooms are a bit tight, or the living space is a bit tight, or there's something ugly that needs fixing, or there's a bit of asbestos that everyone's gravitating to. Sometimes the agents can recognise negatives in a property and sort of prepare the vendor for them, but underestimate how significant that negative thing is. And so that's usually what gives rise to that pricing conversation. Let's get your expectations down a notch, and let's lower the quote range and pull in some more people.
Yes.
Kind of seems like a constantly shifting target for the agents to be aiming at.
Yeah, look, it goes both ways. Let's talk about quote ranges changing, because you see it happening. Sometimes it's a genuine effort to reduce the vendor's expectations to get the property sold. I mean, that's the agent's job, to sell the property for the best price they can muster. If it's not looking like the pricing's working for the vendor, they'll do what they have to do. And when you've got 75 groups going through a property and it feels like a nightclub, well, the agent's got to up the quote range, because that is too many people through a property in this climate. And they don't want to get stung for underquoting or upset everyone, and they need to make sure that they're creating a buyer list that's manageable. Because if 75 people go through a property and 12 people ask for contracts and the agent's phone's going flat out, well, that's too much work for them to manage for buyers that aren't actually likely to all be in the right price range. So the agent will do themselves a favour as well. Talk to the vendor, tell them the campaign's going better than they thought, increase the quote range so that the ones who can't afford it drop off. Then the agent can manage, a more manageable set of buyers. If you see quote ranges moving, it's for those reasons. It's because something's not going well or something's going too well.
So in a situation where the agent sees that they've overquoted and there isn't the interest at the level they were hoping for,
Yes.
what are some of the causes of that for our listeners? And then how might they navigate that situation with an agent? And I guess there's a potential where, like, I guess the concern every time for the vendor is the agent either dupe them by stating they could sell it for more than it was actually worth at the start to get the listing.
Yes.
Yeah, and so, that's going to be in the back of the vendor's mind in that sort of circumstance. Or they're trying to manage them to accept a lower price when they still think it could sell for a higher price, which also could be in the vendor's mind. So how do they, I think it's one of those tricky ones that can arise for a vendor, which it would be great to sort of talk through for our listeners.
Yeah, you raise a good point, Dave, around what we call buying the business. So if the agent buys the listing, it means they've told the vendor more than they should have in order to sound like the attractive agent to go with. And I bring that back to vendors, to be honest. Vendors that pick someone because they promise them a price that's bigger than anyone else has suggested really need to have a careful think about what their selection criteria is for their agent, because a really skilled agent who demonstrates that they can manage buyers well, manage a campaign well, and they know their market well, and that agent will likely have given some sales evidence to the vendors when they're pitching for the business to say, this is where I think your property sits based on these sales, but I will do everything in my power to get you a result above and beyond this, but I want you to be prepared for this result. That's a good agent. Now, if a buyer, a vendor selects an agent because they've told them more than every other agent, well, I'm laying that at the vendor's feet, and I'm calling out a greedy vendor, because you need to have some really compelling science to believe a result that's above and beyond other agents' claims. And most people pull in, the average is 3 agents to give them an appraisal. So if you've got one that's, an outlier, you've got to ask them some more questions rather than just sign them up.
So then that goes a bit to the mindset of the vendor when you're interviewing agents. If you've got one that's promising the world, even though we might have some cognitive biases that wants us to believe that agent, we need to be realistic and ask the questions of why they're offering such a high price. And also, we really need to have done our own due diligence in advance to meeting with the agents ourselves as well, shouldn't we? So
I
we
totally
can
agree.
Yeah.
So the way that the price change conversation goes, when it's an agent that you have trust with, and they've been straight with you and they've been nurturing you and they're making this recommendation for good reason, that can be a confronting conversation. Let's lower the quote range and attract some more people. If they're doing their job and that they're an experienced agent, you'd expect the vendor to take their counsel and to follow it. But vendors do struggle with underquoting. They don't like the dishonesty. They don't like feeling that they're duping people out there. And I think that's admirable. But I've seen situations where an agent's got a very honest vendor who is insisting on quoting the property where they'd like to sell it. And for the agent, they're putting a price range on a property and knowing that buyers will likely walk to the other underquoted properties and their campaign will suffer. That's a tough conversation. And in some cases, you need to have a different campaign approach if your vendor is...
It's a really good point to raise, though, as well, because it's sort of the other side of the coin as well, to think of the downside of actually quoting accurately when everyone else is slightly underquoting.
The way that I've seen some agents deal with it, and it's very clever, is they'll declare the reserve in the advertising. They'll go, all right, fine, you want to quote the property at where you'd be happy to sell it, let's just be super transparent. And that can work.
Well, I've never seen that before.
No, I've got an agent in Williamstown that does that, and it's refreshing.
So let's say we've got the 3 agents coming, Cate. Not all vendors will understand the data that, CoreLogic and Pricefinder have on the comparable sales. I mean, would you suggest that they say to their agents, I want you to bring comparables and discuss why you think it's higher and lower, and then they can drive past? And I mean, that's seems to me like a really accelerated way to get their finger on the pulse of the local market. Would agents do that?
Yes, they do. An agent can press a button on RP data and generate a CMA really quickly. I don't think they're worth the paper they're printed on, to be honest, because it's an algorithm, and I always believe that a human should touch that stuff. But an agent who's gone through their comparable sales report and issued it to the vendor and talks them through it, that's a really good scientific approach. And most vendors are handed something by the agent that pitches. It's very rare that an agent wouldn't be prepped with comparable sales on hand, but it's the integrity of the data that's important, and the way that the agent has dialogue with them about which properties truly compare to theirs.
Nice.
So obviously there's a lot of planning involved in running an auction and just choosing to sell a house via auction. When the vendor first signs the exclusive authority to sell via auction, there must be quite a bit of rigid planning at the start.
Yeah, that's right. So the authority will come with a calendar as well, and the vendor will be able to see all of the steps that they need to take pre-campaign. So they'll be fixing some maintenance items, maybe improving things. They might be painting the property or getting it recarpeted or putting in a garden. You'll see a lot of properties that are prepped for sale and these things are done. And all of that has to happen before the photo's done. And then you've got your stylist and your advertising and marketing to consider. So there's a lot of investment in that campaign. Auction day is so significant, Dave. It's the big day, and all of those 2 or 3 or 4 weeks are aiming towards getting a great outcome on that particular day. And
which will give it a hot entire episode dedicated to just auction day.
We will, yeah. We're talking about what happens behind the scenes leading up to auction day in this episode.
Yeah.
But it's important to think that while it's a really big investment for the vendors, it's a massive investment for the agent, because the agent hasn't made a dollar. They're spending all their time, they're coordinating stylists, and they're running around getting painters organised. I mean, the agents can do all of those things these days. They're very hands-on, and it's intensive. So the agent wants to get a result on auction day as well, because they're dealing with nurturing buyers throughout the campaign. They're talking to the vendor every time there's an open. And vendors, if your agent isn't talking to you after every open, then something's wrong, because that's the level of service you should be anticipating. They're in dialogue 2, 3, 4 times a week with the vendor, and they're dealing with all of their emotions and fears as well. They're having to pivot every time something quirky happens with the campaign. And so if the auction day is a fizzer, the agent stands to lose the listing altogether, and they don't get any payment at all for all of their work. So it's a high stakes game for more than just the vendor.
Well, Cate, we are going to talk about auction day in episode 2, but I want to buy this place prior to auction, and I've engaged you to help me. Now, I've heard stories about agents saying, we're not accepting offers prior to auction, just turn up on the day and give us your best. But I'm worried that there's a lot of demand in this property, and I want to try and take it off the market. And sometimes you hear agents say no, other times they'll say we're now accepting offers, or an offer's been accepted, and you're like, wow, well, you told me there wasn't any, and then you have to race to get in touch to go, well, am I in this mix anymore? Like, why does that happen, and how do people like me trying to buy this place before that red hot auction day get the job done?
Interesting. It's a good question. So there's 2 questions here that I need to talk about. The first one is, can this property physically be sold before auction, or does it have to legally go to auction? Because there are some reasons why a property can't be sold prior, and there's no point showing your cards and pushing an offer forward and harassing the agent if it's a court-ordered auction. So in a lot of family law situations, it has to run. Sometimes it might be that you've got a deceased estate and it has to run. Other times you've got multiple family members bidding on auction day. They can't sell it prior. So there's quite a few legal reasons. I've just touched on 3. But if the property has to run to auction, you're wasting your time. But in most cases, 98% of auctions, I'd say, they could sell it prior, they're just choosing not to. So, Mike, if someone else has triggered a pre-auction offer and it's now going to sell prior, but the agent didn't want to let you be that guy, it's because you weren't talking at the right level. You've got to give an agent a lot of confidence that you've got the right money to take this off the market. Because if you're talking in the range or at a level that they know they've got covered well and truly, they'll brush you off and they'll tell you that the vendor wants their day in the sun.
I was playing silly buggers. I guess if you listen to any episode where I'm on this show, that kind of makes sense if you work backwards. But I mean, does that kind of relate to that initial problem? Like if you play too sort of silly, then they're going to go, you're not a serious person, so you're not going to get the level of service?
Sadly, it's not actually about playing silly buggers. It's about playing innocent. A lot of first home buyers walk up with big wide eyes and love the property, and not even first home buyers, upgraders, people that aren't doing this day in, day out. They get excited about a property. It's nowhere near where they need to be because they haven't done their pricing analysis and they're already pestering the agent about buying prior. And is it any wonder why it's usually buyers advocates that trigger a pre-auction offer? If we want to do that, we'll go in for the kill. We'll know the right price. We'll have already had the dialogue with the agent. We know how to have it without showing our cards. It's a very highly skilled approach when you're not wanting to show too much, but you're wanting to purchase a property and give them confidence. And I often have to talk about other properties. How do you think this compares to X, rather than saying I've actually got 3.5 and you're quoting it 3 to 3.1. You can have that honest conversation with them about pricing, and then vendor motivation, what they'd like to see, how many buyers they're dealing with, and how they'll have how they'll coordinate the sale prior to auction if there's multiple bidders. You need to know all of these things. And I see some buyers will trigger pre-auction offer and they'll get the property on the market, and then they'll be upset when the agent says, all right, we're now taking best and highest, you get one crack. I would rather go to auction than blind bid. So there's a lot of skill behind getting it on the market, and rookies don't always know how to do that. So that's why you'll often see advocates will bring it to a head, or someone who knows the market and they've been in the market for a while, and the agent has confidence that they'll do what they say they're going to do.
Yeah. And if you bring it back to that point of if someone hasn't showed their cards and come up, they've spoken about a figure, potentially and more likely through naivety than anything else, because they don't they're only buying a property like most people once every 10 years. Yeah. Probably. We're not great at most things we do once every 10 years. And, the agent has a serious buyer's agent who they know, who will pay the right price for the property. And then they've spoken to 28 other random people, and there's been varying degrees of understanding the information and how serious those 28 other people who've done an inspection. They might call 3 of them, they might call 5 of them, might depend how busy they are on that day, might depend on how many other listings they have and how many other auctions they've got going on. There's all these other factors that come into the end of the day. You've got someone doing their job, just like everyone who's, doing their day-to-day job, and we're all making decisions on where we spend our time on any given day. And sometimes it will be as simple as that the agent, you might have been the 4th person on the list or the 6th person on the list, but they didn't call you. They only got to 5 people who they called and let know that, we've got an offer that we're happy with and we're going to sell prior to auction. So, I'm just sort of also throwing it around from the agent's perspective, which is sort of the approach we're taking to this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's knowledge is power when you know what's happening behind the scenes or standing in their shoes. And we've talked a little bit about pre-auction offers, but properties can sell prior to auction, not necessarily because there's strong competing interest to stop the auction. The agent can influence the way that goes when they've got one strong buyer and no one else.
Yeah.
You'd say to a vendor, we've got this red hot buyer, we've got no one really who's at the right level out of all of the people that have been through the property. Let's try and get them to buy it prior. And the clever agent will let that strong buyer think that there's competing interest, and then they might tease an offer out of them and then say, look, the vendor's prepared to sell at this level, but I've got to go back to everyone else. So if we do that, it's best and highest. Or if you want to increase your offer and give me something really compelling, I won't go back to everyone else. I always say be very wary of that kind of dialogue, because sometimes they're just working you up because you're all they've got. And how do you know? Well, an experienced negotiator will get to the core of that, but it's very hard for buyers to determine that. Sometimes I'll say to an agent, yeah, nah, I want to see you on auction day. And that's my opportunity to get for the best price.
Yeah. And that's one of the big risks, isn't it, to the less experienced buyers who just show their cards prior to the auction. They have that conversation. The experienced, good negotiating agent does get, give or take, what they're willing to pay, and then says, look, that's not enough and we're taking it to auction. But we now know what you have.
Yes. And it's very hard to determine whether there's a bluff or not. If an agent lets you know that they've received an acceptable offer and you've got an opportunity to put your offer in, you've got to make sure you take that seriously. You don't want to think that they're bluffing and then it sells. But if an agent's hounding you to be the first person to make an offer and they're really pushing you, maybe you're all they've got.
Look, that's been a great first episode on behind the scenes running an auction from an agent's perspective. Before we get into our second episode and finish it right through to auction day, are there either of you got a gold nugget you'd like to share?
Now it's time for us to go mining for our gold nugget property tip of the day.
I do, Dave. I didn't realise until a couple of years ago that buyer's agents offered piecemeal services. You don't have to do the holus bolus asset selection and negotiation, all that sort of stuff. You can actually say, look, I really want this property, but it's going to auction, and hire someone like Cate to do that sort of stuff. And Cate sort of shared an insight into why that's so important, because you've got this agent that's playing that kind of game, and you do it once every 10 years, once every 5, 7, whatever the data is. They're doing it day in, day out. They're going to be better at it than you. And if they're a good agent in their patch, they're going to be better than the average agents that are already better than you. So it's just kind of like, you got to think this is not a level playing field. You're going up against someone that has a job for the vendor, and they're going to play you like a cheap violin if they can.
Yeah,
the checks in the mail, Mike. Thanks for that.
But it's a great explanation of the benefits of using a quality buyer's agent, isn't it? When you're buying. Cate, what's yours?
I got a gold nugget. You've got to remember that the agent's dealing with a vendor who has their own personality, and it's actually okay if you're trying to negotiate or get a bit more information on the campaign. Just say to the agent, tell me about your vendor. You know, what's making them tick? What are they basing their expectations on? Or, you know, what sort of personality are you dealing with? Because that can give you a little bit of insight as well, especially if a negotiation ensues prior to the auction.
Yeah, that's a great insight for our listeners to discuss and get on the front foot when they're dealing with the agents, rather than always being reactive to the questions the agents are asking them. So superb. I've really enjoyed that episode.
Great cricketing metaphor to end on as well, Dave. That was exemplary.
Orange card.
All right. We'll see you very soon in a week's time. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Cheers.